What if I told you that a tiny island nation smaller than New York City secretly controls more global infrastructure than most superpowers? While everyone's watching China and the US, Singapore has quietly built the world's most invisible financial empire. And they own pieces of everything from your morning coffee to the energy powering your home. We're counting down the 10 most shocking ways Singapore's secret investment machine controls global commerce. And number 1 will reveal how they've positioned themselves to literally control the flow of world trade. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're about to expose financial power moves that most governments don't even realize are happening. 10. The Sovereign Wealth Fund Shadow Empire. Singapore operates the world's most secretive sovereign wealth funds, and most people have never even heard their names. GIC and Temasek Holdings manage over $800 billion in global assets, but unlike Norway's Transparent Oil Fund, Singapore's funds operate in near total secrecy. They're in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to London, making decisions that affect millions while staying completely invisible. Singapore's sovereign wealth funds manage more assets per capita than any other nation, roughly $140,000 for every Singaporean citizen invested globally. While other countries debate foreign investment policies, Singapore has been quietly accumulating ownership stakes in critical global infrastructure for decades, creating influence networks that transcend traditional diplomatic power. But these funds are just the tip of Singapore's investment iceberg. 9. The port empire that spans continents. Singapore doesn't just run one of the world's busiest ports. They secretly control port operations on every continent. Through PSA International, Singapore operates ports from Belgium to Brazil, from India to Italy. When your Amazon package arrives from overseas, there's a good chance it passed through Singapore-controlled infrastructure at multiple points in its journey. PSA International operates 50-plus ports worldwide, handling over 80 million containers annually across 26 countries. That's roughly 10% of global container traffic. By controlling port infrastructure globally, Singapore has created choke points in international trade that give them massive leverage over global supply chains, far beyond their tiny geographic size. Their port network is just one piece of their infrastructure strategy. 8. The energy web that powers nations. Singapore has quietly become one of the world's largest energy traders, despite producing almost no oil or gas themselves. Through companies like Trafigura and Vital's Singapore operations, plus massive investments in energy infrastructure, Singapore controls oil refineries in Australia, gas terminals in Europe, and renewable energy projects across Southeast Asia. They've made themselves indispensable to global energy flows. Singapore is the world's third largest oil trading hub, handling over 50 million tons of petroleum products annually and controlling energy assets worth over $200 billion globally. In a world where energy security equals national security, Singapore has positioned itself as the essential middleman in global energy markets, giving them influence over countries far larger and more resource-rich. But energy is just one sector where Singapore has mastered the middleman strategy. 7. The financial tentacles in every market. Singapore's banks don't just serve Asia. They've quietly embedded themselves in the financial systems of 4 continents. DBS Bank, OCBC, and UOB have systematically acquired stakes in banks from Hong Kong to London to New York. They process payments, provide trade financing, and manage assets for companies that have no idea they're dealing with Singapore-controlled entities. Singapore's 3 major banks manage over $1.5 trillion in assets and have operations in 35-plus countries, making them among Asia's most internationally integrated financial institutions. By embedding themselves in global financial infrastructure, Singapore has created an information advantage and influence network that allows them to anticipate and shape market movements worldwide. Their financial reach extends into an even more surprising sector. 6. The Real Estate Shadow Network. Singapore's investment funds own prime real estate in every major global city, and most people living and working in these buildings have no idea. Walk through Manhattan's financial district, London's Canary Wharf, or Sydney's CBD, and you're likely walking through Singapore-owned buildings. Mapletree, Capitaland, and other Singapore REITs have quietly assembled massive global property portfolios. Singapore REITs and property companies own over $300 billion in real estate assets globally, including iconic buildings in 30-plus countries, from office towers to shopping malls to logistics hubs. Real estate ownership in key global cities translates to influence over business districts, control of commercial rents, and the ability to shape urban development. Soft power that's completely invisible, but incredibly effective. But their most strategic investments are in something even more critical. 5. The technology backbone takeover. While everyone worries about Chinese tech dominance, Singapore has been quietly buying up the digital infrastructure that powers the global internet. Singapore's sovereign funds have major stakes in data center companies, submarine cable networks, and cloud infrastructure providers. They own pieces of the physical internet, the servers, cables, and facilities that make global digital communication possible. Singapore-linked entities control over $100 billion in global technology infrastructure, including major stakes in data center operators managing facilities across 4 continents. In the digital age, controlling internet infrastructure is like controlling the highways of the 21st century. Singapore has positioned itself as a critical node in global digital communications, creating dependencies that give them outsized influence. Their tech strategy extends to an even more futuristic domain. 4. The space and defense power play. Singapore's investment tentacles reach literally into space, and their defense technology investments could reshape global security. Through strategic investments and partnerships, Singapore has stakes in satellite networks, space technology companies, and defense contractors across multiple countries. They're building capabilities that most people associate only with superpowers. Singapore's defense and aerospace investments exceed $50 billion globally, including stakes in companies that provide satellite services, defense systems, and aerospace technology to dozens of nations. By investing in space and defense technology, Singapore is positioning itself as an indispensable partner for national security infrastructure, creating dependencies that transcend traditional military alliances. But perhaps their most brilliant strategy involves something everyone uses daily. 3. The supply chain puppet master. Singapore doesn't just participate in global supply chains. They've systematically positioned themselves to control the critical nodes where everything breaks if they're disrupted. From semiconductor manufacturing equipment to pharmaceutical distribution networks to agricultural commodity trading, Singapore has invested in the bottleneck points of global trade. They've made themselves indispensable to industries that keep the world running. Singapore controls or has major influence over supply chain nodes handling over $2 trillion in annual global trade, including critical choke points in technology, healthcare, and food systems. By controlling supply chain bottlenecks, Singapore has created a form of economic leverage that's more powerful than traditional military force. The ability to disrupt entire industries globally through strategic infrastructure control. This supply chain strategy reveals their ultimate masterstroke. 2. The currency and payment system web. Singapore has quietly embedded itself so deeply in global payment systems that they could literally disrupt international commerce with a flip of a switch. Through investments in payment processors, currency exchange systems, and trade financing networks, Singapore has made itself essential to how money moves around the world. They process trillions in transactions that most countries don't even realize flow through Singapore-controlled systems. Singapore-based or Singapore-controlled entities handle over $5 trillion in annual payment flows and currency exchanges, making it one of the world's most critical financial infrastructure hubs. In a global economy dependent on seamless financial transactions, controlling payment infrastructure gives Singapore the ability to influence international trade flows and economic relationships far beyond their size. But their ultimate secret weapon combines all these strategies into something unprecedented. 1. The invisible economic empire strategy. Here's the mind-blowing truth. Singapore has built the world's first truly invisible empire, one that controls global commerce without anyone realizing they're being controlled. Unlike historical empires that used military force or colonial administration, Singapore has created economic dependencies through strategic investments that make them essential to global functioning. Countries that have never considered Singapore a major player suddenly discovered they can't function without Singapore-controlled infrastructure. Combined, Singapore's sovereign wealth funds, state-linked enterprises, and strategic investments control over $3 trillion in global assets across every critical sector: ports, energy, finance, technology, real estate, and supply chains. Singapore has achieved something unprecedented: global influence without conquest, control without confrontation. They've made themselves indispensable to the world economy through pure strategic brilliance, creating 21st century power that's invisible but unstoppable. This is the new model for how small nations can achieve superpower influence. So there you have it. Singapore isn't just a small, wealthy city-state. It's a strategic mastermind that's built an invisible economic empire spanning every continent and controlling critical infrastructure that keeps the global economy running. They've proven that in the modern world, smart investments matter more than large armies or vast territories. Did any of these Singapore investment strategies shock you? Do you think other small nations can replicate this model, or is Singapore's success impossible to duplicate? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this investigation into Singapore's hidden global empire opened your eyes to how real power works in the modern world, subscribe and hit notifications. We uncover the invisible forces shaping global economics that mainstream media never talks about.